While the Renault FT had served admirably during the First World War, by the late 1920s, it was becoming clear that this vehicle was obsolete and the French Army started looking for a replacement. In this episode, we look at two of the attempts to replace the FT, vehicles that, while produced in relatively small numbers, would survive to see combat in 1940, the Char D series and the FCM 36. Hello and welcome to Tank and AFV News. My name is Tom and you are watching the Tanks of World War II video series. Now in this episode we continue our look at the tanks used in the 1940 German invasion of France. Now last episode we looked at the Renault FT. Now this was a World War I veteran that was still in service with the French Army in 1940, albeit in a rather limited role. Now this week we look at two of the several vehicles, or vehicle series I should say, that were introduced as a replacement for the old FT. That's the Char D series, which consisted of the Char D1 and the Char D2, and the FMC 36. Now you may be asking yourself, why are we combining these vehicles into one episode? Because they're actually three distinctly different tanks. The answer is basically expediency. You know, these are separate vehicles, but none of these were built in particular large numbers compared to some of the other French tanks in 1940. I also didn't want to spend an entire episode on each of them, especially considering the number of different French tanks that we have to cover in this 1940 series. However, all of these vehicles I'm talking about today did see combat in 1940, so I didn't want to just leave them out completely, especially since they're interesting in their own right. Now, one of the things about the French Army in 1940 is that they had a truly bewildering array of different model tanks in service at that time, many of which seemed not all that different from each other in terms of capability. Now, it may seem that the Germans, with four different models of Panzers, the Panzer 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then also the two Czech design Panzers, the 35 and the 38, had a lot of different types of tanks. However, it does pale in comparison to the different models of French tanks, which included the FT, the R35, the H35, H39, FMC 36, the D1, the D2, the B1 BIS, the AMR, and the S35 Somois, and even a handful of the giant and ancient Char 2Cs were still around in 1940. So, of course, we haven't even touched on the variety of British tanks also in the BEF that are in the 1940 campaign. So you can see there's just a lot of ground to cover in 1940. So that is why I'm sort of squishing a few of these relatively lesser important tanks into one episode. Now, as we covered last episode, the Renault FT light tank was by far the most successful French tank design of the First World War, and France had a great many of them left in their inventory after that war was finished. These tanks formed the backbone of their tank fleet during the 1920s, but with the rapid development of internal combustion engine design in that period, it became clear at a certain point that these old Great War veterans were becoming outdated. Several attempts to modernize the FT had been undertaken, resulting in the FT NC series and the FT Cagris, I believe that's how you say it, it's a rubber-tracked version. Now, these improved variants only featured improvements to the suspension of the vehicle, not to the armor or firepower. So in 1927, a new effort was made at a more comprehensive improvement, which was tested in 1928 and approved for service in 1929. Now this model was called the Char D1, and it featured a number of improvements over the old FT series. These improvements included 30mm thick armor, a more powerful engine, a 47mm gun, and a coaxial machine gun, as well as a third crew member, a radio man. Now, due to all these improvements, the D1 was substantially larger than the old FT tanks, and production would be a relatively costly endeavor for a nation that had significantly reduced military spending in the post-World War I period. However, money was allocated by the French government, and the D1 went into production from 1931 to 1935, with 160 vehicles being built. Now, I had said that included an improved 47mm gun compared to the old FT, but that's not true at first. The turret, which was designed by Schneider, there were delays in that, and so that turret, which is called the ST2, wasn't available at first. So the earliest D1 tanks actually were equipped with just old FT turrets. Later they would get the ST2 turret, so it's something to keep in mind there. And this tank, the D1, would represent really the only modern tank in the French inventory, sort of in that sort of early to mid-30s period, before production in the late 30s ramped up. So in that period, these tanks saw quite a bit of use as the primary modern tank. So that by the late 30s, they were pretty worn out, and they shipped them down to Tunisia to serve in the colonies. When the war broke out in 1940, a number of them would be shipped back to France and would see combat. Now, throughout the 1920s, France had been working on a much larger armored vehicle, which would later become known as the Char B1. Now, this vehicle will be examined in a later episode, but it's important to know that while this vehicle was being developed, France was in the middle of armament treaty negotiations that could potentially limit the weight of tanks to 20 tons. Now, since the Char B1 was considered sort of, it was much larger, and it was a 30-ton vehicle, so way over that 20-ton limit, France wanted a backup plan in case the treaty went into effect and the Char B1 was no longer allowed. Now, since the D1 had already grown into a vehicle larger than the light infantry support tank it was replacing, it made sense for it to be developed into a medium battle tank, and this variant would become known as the D2. Now, it featured welded armor, a new, more powerful engine, and at least on the later versions, a newer 47mm gun than what was equipped on the D1. Eventually, Germany pulled out of the League of Nations completely, which meant the end of the armaments treaty negotiations. And that meant that France could go forward with the Char B1 program. However, due to delays and issues with the Char B1, they decided to produce a number of the D2 tanks anyway. Total production was 100, and these were produced in 2 batches of 50, with delivery starting in 1937. By 1939, it was determined that due to issues with the D2, it would not be one of the tanks chosen for mass production as war rapidly approached. Now, that's the quick version of the history of the D1 and D2. Let's move on to the other tank we're looking at, the FCM 36. This was another tank that didn't really make the cut in 1939 when the French saw war coming and decided to really start cranking out tanks in large numbers. And the history of this tank goes back to the early 30s. French doctrine of the period called for a large number of light infantry support tanks, a role that was initially filled by the FT of World War I fame. Now, by the early 30s, the French Army realized that the D1, which was in many ways designed to be an improved FT, wasn't really the substitute they were looking for. Part of the problem was that the D series, with its extra crewman, was a lot bigger and more expensive than they imagined FT replacement to be. Also, it was just an older design that was getting outdated, and the existing vehicles were getting worn out. Therefore, in 1933, several different companies submitted designs for an FT replacement more along the lines of the original vehicle, being a small 2-man tank suited toward the French conception of what an infantry support tank should be. Now, the 2 most important entries were the Renault R35 and the Hotchkiss H35. Now, these 2 vehicles are really quite similar in appearance and would go on to form a large percentage of the French tank fleet in 1940. However, we're going to look at those in a later episode, probably the next episode. Now, today we're going to talk about the FCM 36, a competitor to the Renault and Hotchkiss entries. Now, the FCM 36, while not winning the contract, obviously, was still deemed interesting enough by the French Army that they placed an order for 100 of them. 2 features differentiated the FCM 36 from the R35 and H35, and those were that it had welded armor, which also utilized quite a bit of sloping in the design, and it had a diesel engine, in contrast to the gasoline engines used in most of the other tanks. Now, the FCM 36 was actually considered to be the best of these new infantry tanks, but its production was limited due to delays caused by the advanced welding techniques used in its construction and its higher cost compared to the other infantry tank designs. Now, all 3 of these tanks, the D1, the D2, and the FCM 36, saw combat in 1940, although they made up a rather small percentage of the French total tank force. Much more prolific, as we said earlier, were the Renault R35, the Hotchkiss 35, and later Hotchkiss 39 variant, the Char B1 bis, and the S35 Somois. Now, these vehicles will be covered in, I think, our next 3 episodes is my tentative plan at this point. The technical descriptions of these vehicles is going to be somewhat cursory because, frankly, really detailed descriptions of these particular vehicles have not really been published in English. And in case of the French D1, for sure, there's not even a copy of it that exists in the world for someone to go out and examine. That said, we're going to cover the basics as usual. Now, one thing you'll notice in this episode and in the next few is that a lot of these French tanks in 1940 are not all that different from each other in terms of capabilities. This is due in part to many of them having their origin as being a modernization or a replacement for the old FT. So while the German designs of 1940 generally show an increase in capabilities from each subsequent model, with the French tanks we see a lot of duplication of capabilities across several different model types. Now we're going to start with the D1 since it comes first on our timeline. Of the tanks we're looking at today, this one is the one that's most closely related to the old FT. Essentially, Renault took the technology developed in their FT, Caprice, and NC model tanks, which were themselves an improvement on the old FT, and improved them even more. Those older improvements primarily focused on just the suspension. The D series was a total reworking of it to make it a larger hull, giving it a crew of 3. Now, it roughly resembled the old FT in layout, although it did have a more modern spring suspension system. The armor was 30 millimeters at the thickest, and that was a decent amount of armor protection by the standards of the 1920s. Now, it had a 74 horsepower Renault 25CV engine, which propelled it at a top speed of about 11 miles an hour, which again was considerably faster than the old FT and not bad for 1920s era. Early production models, like we said in the history part, did have the old FT turrets initially, but later the Schneider ST2 turret was made available. Now, like many French turrets, the ST2 turret would be made from a casting rather than flat armor plate riveted or welded together. In this period, France was one of the leaders in casting techniques and used castings extensively in a lot of their tank designs, unlike Germany, who almost exclusively used welded plate. Now, the ST2 turret was armed with both a 47 millimeter SA-34 cannon and a coaxial 7.5 millimeter machine gun. Now, this was a substantial improvement on the old FT, which housed either a cannon or a machine gun, but not both at the same time. Now, the 47 millimeter gun sounds impressive compared to a lot of the other vehicles of the period, which had 37 millimeter guns. However, the SA-34 is a fairly low velocity gun. It was not particularly effective in terms of armor penetration. And it was definitely inferior to the SA-35 47 millimeter gun that equipped some of the other French tanks that we'll see in upcoming episodes. Like most French tanks of the period, the ST2 turret accommodated only one person who had to serve as the tank commander, gunner, and loader all at the same time. And while these one-man turrets were in general rather inefficient, from a ergonomic standpoint, the ST2 turret was regarded as worse than usual in these terms. So from the sources that are available, they say that the commander, depending on what job he was doing at any one minute, whether it's loading the gun, firing it, or trying to use the vision slits, had to adjust his position inside the turret. So not an easy vehicle to operate in that regard. He did get a little bit of help in terms of the loading from the radio operator, who could at least, who was down in the hull, but he could still, some of the ammunition that was stowed away from the turret, he could hand it up to the commander to help him out in that regard. And then, of course, the third crew member was the driver. He sat in the front of the vehicle, sort of in the standard position as you'd expect. Now, the Char D2 was an improved version of the D1, and it had the same general layout. However, it was heavier at around 20 tons total, and it had armor protection of 40 millimeters. Also, it made use of welded plate on the hull rather than the riveted plate of the D1. Now, the engine was a 6-cylinder Renault model generating 150 horsepower, and that gave the vehicle a top speed of 14 miles an hour. Did away with the troublesome ST2 turret and used the APX series of turrets. Now, production was split into 2 batches of 50 vehicles each. Now, the first batch was equipped with the XP1 turret that was armed with the SA-34 gun, which we stated earlier. It was the same gun that was used in the D1 variant. Now, the second batch had the improved APX turret, which was equipped with the more powerful SA-35 cannon. Now, moving on to the Char D2, this was an improved version of the D1, and it had the same general layout. However, it was heavier at around 20 tons and had armor protection a maximum of 40 millimeters. Now, it also made use of welded plate on the hull rather than the riveted plate of the D1. The engine was a 6-cylinder Renault model generating 150 horsepower, which gave the vehicle a top speed of around 14 miles an hour. So both an armor and speed increase over the D1. It did away with the troublesome ST2 turret, and it used the APX1 turret. Production was split between 2 batches of 50 vehicles each. The first batch was equipped with the SA-34 gun, which of course is the same cannon that was in the D1. The second batch was equipped with the SA-35 gun, which had better armor piercing capabilities. Now these APX turrets, whether there are a few different types, the APX-1, the APX-4, they were not exclusive to the D1 and D2 tanks, but in fact were used on a variety of different French tanks, as we'll see in later episodes. Now onto the FCM-36. Now this was a smaller tank with only 2 crew, a driver, and of course a commander slash gunner slash loader in a 1-man turret, having to do all 3 of those jobs. It weighed in about 13 tons, and it had a diesel engine, which was a little unusual for the time, and that cranked out 91 horsepower, which propelled the small tank at a top speed of about 15 miles an hour. Now diesel engines were not the common type in French tanks at this time, and were fairly rare in tanks in general at that point. As the series progressed, we shall see more examples of diesel engines in tanks, but overall, gasoline was still the most common form of fuel used in armored vehicles during the war. Armament was not that impressive, consisting of the same old World War I era 37mm gun that was used in the old FT tanks, although it did have a coax 75mm machine gun. As noted earlier, the FCM-36 was fairly unique in that it was of entirely welded construction, unlike its competitors, the R-35 and the H-35, which had cast armor. Now this meant it had its own unique turret design rather than using the APX-R turret, which was shared by both the Renault and Hotchkiss tanks. Now in many regards, the FCM-36 was considered better than the R-35 and H-35 by the French Army, but only 100 were built. An additional order was considered but never went forward, in part because of the higher cost of the vehicle compared to comparable other vehicles, but also because it was decided that the FCM facility should prioritize production on the more formidable Char B1 BIS tank. Since none of the 3 tanks we're looking at today were produced in large numbers, there are not that many variants to look at. With the D1, there was one example of a command vehicle based on that hull, which was called the Char Observatoire. As far as the D2 goes, there were a couple different prototypes made for a flamethrower tank, also a turretless tank destroyer. Neither of these went beyond a single prototype. For the FCM-36, there's also not much as far as variants, at least not from the French. After the fall of France, much of the French tank arsenal fell into the hands of the German army as war booty, and they would create a number of different self-propelled guns and other specialty vehicles based on a lot of these leftover French chassis. Now this included 10 FCM-36 vehicles that they captured and converted into Marder 1 tank destroyers. However, I'm not going to get too much into the Marder series right now. We're going to leave that for an episode in the future. Since all 3 of these tanks were built in fairly low numbers, it's easy to get fairly specific with units that use them. The D1 had, by the late 1930s, been exiled to North Africa and for colonial duty. They're equipped 3 battalions, the 61, 65th, and 67th BCC, Battalion des Chars de Combat. Now, due to the poor condition of these vehicles by 1940, the ones that were still running, essentially, were given to the 67th BCC, and they were shipped back to France to meet the German invaders. The D2 had a different fate from the D1 in that it was not consigned to the infantry tank battalions intended for supporting infantry divisions. Instead, it ended up equipping units that would find themselves part of the 4th DCR in 1940. Now the DCR, it's the Division Cuirassé, was essentially the closest things the French had to an armored division, although with a lot fewer supporting troops and less personnel overall than a German panzer division. Now 4 DCR is most notable in that its commander in 1940 France was Charles de Gaulle, a name that you'll probably recognize for being one of the major figures in French 20th century history, of course. Now the FCM 36 was assigned to duty in 2 separate battalions. Now these were named BCL, Bataillon des Chars Légers. I'm not sure exactly why and how they differed in any meaningful sense from the BCCs. Anyhow, those 2 battalions were designated 4E and 7E. And like the BCCs, these battalions consisted of 3 companies of 13 tanks, each with 45 total tanks in a battalion. So, like we said, the FCM 36, 100 were built, 45 per battalion, so that's why there's 2 battalions of them, plus, a few spares. All 3 of these tank types fought in the battle for France in 1940, although none played a particularly important role given their few numbers. The D1 battalion that had been shipped over from North Africa engaged German forces, albeit not very successfully. This unit was part of the defense of the village of Souan and fell victim to the 8th Panzer Division. Now the battalion lost all of its D1 tanks, including 25 being completely destroyed and 18 captured. It's a total of 45, it's a number in a battalion. Of the D1 tanks left in North Africa, these were concentrated into the Brigade Légère Mécanique, which ended up joining the Allied forces after Operation Torch. Now, at the Battle of Kasserine Pass, it's claimed that this unit actually did manage to knock out a German Panzer IV tank, which is kind of impressive considering the poor armor penetration capabilities of its 47mm gun. Now, unfortunately, as we stated earlier, not a single D1 tank survives to this day. None were produced after the war, so you can't go to a museum and look at one, unfortunately. Now, the D2 was not particularly effective in the fighting in 1940, since most of them had a good deal of wear and tear by that point and suffered from reliability issues. Several D2 tanks were in the process of being rebuilt when hostilities commenced, making them unavailable for combat. Of the 84 tanks known to be delivered to French Army units, 21 were destroyed by enemy action, 38 abandoned after breakdown, 12 sent to depot, and the rest in various states. One of them was listed as having fallen into a ravine. But as you can see, more of them were abandoned from breakdown than destroyed by enemy action, which says something about the state of these particular tanks and just of the French armored forces in 1940 and the state of sort of unpreparedness and transition that they found themselves in. Now, the FCM 36, being a somewhat newer vehicle, fared somewhat better in combat. Both of the FE and the 7E BCLs were engaged with German forces at the critical crossing of the Meuse River. The 7E collided with a German vanguard containing Panzer III tanks, and according to at least one source I read, they engaged in a short-range gun battle. Now, the 37mm guns of both tanks proved to be not very effective against the armor of their opponent. However, the French tanks did get the worst of it, withdrawing and leaving 26 of their 36 tanks behind. Now, the 4E BCL was engaged in some of the vicious fighting in the city of Stone until driven from those positions. Now, we're going to hear more about Stone again when we get to the episode on the Char B1 bis. There's some very interesting history on that, but that's going to be 2 or 3 episodes down the road. Now we come to the evaluation part of the video. Now, these 3 vehicles we looked at, the D1, the D2, the FCM 36, they're not by any stretch the most important vehicles in the French inventory at this point, and they don't really have a huge effect on the 1940 campaign. Now, the D1 was really quite old by this point and it suffered from reliability issues. The D2, well, somewhat newer, still older than most of the French tanks, which had, were fairly new to the inventory in 1940. So it also had some wear and tear problems. Unfortunately, those both had, 47mm guns of different types, which was better than the issue that the FCM 36 had. Now, FCM 36, it was newer, it didn't have the issue of being worn out, but it did have the same problem that its stablemates, the H-35 and R-35 had, which was a single person turret equipped with that really not very effective 37mm gun. One other issue that should be kept in mind is that a great deal of the French tank fleet that saw service in 1940 was built up in the relatively short period when in the late 1930s it was becoming obvious to everyone that war was on the horizon in Europe. That means that many of these French tank units had very little time training on their particular vehicles, as well as getting experience operating as a unit as a whole. French tankers were lacking experience, while their German opponents had been in Spain in 36, marched into Austria and Czechoslovakia, and then invaded Poland in 1939. This gap in experience showed itself in the many logistical failures of the French tank forces as the 1940 campaign went forward. Many of French vehicles ended up being abandoned due to breakdown or lack of fuel. So unfortunately, French bravery could not make up for a lack of training and experience that a lot of these French units just did not have compared to their German adversary. While there were a lot of technical and operational issues that caused French tank forces to be less efficient than their German opponent, we cannot really lay the blame for the fall of France in 1940 solely at the feet of French tankers. Even bigger issues were the failure of the French command at the highest level. They misinterpreted the strategic situation. They concocted an overall battle plan that was completely predictable by the German war planners, and then when the situation started to deteriorate, responded far too slowly to reverse the fortunes of the campaign. And now for our recommended reading list for those that want to learn more. This list is going to be a little shorter than some of the others, partly because there just hasn't been as much written in English, at least on French tanks of the 1940 campaign. There are a few sources, though. Going way back, in the 1970s, there was an old series called Profile AFE Weapons, and issues number 58 and 59 in that series looked at French infantry tanks, so it's a two-parter. Issue number 58, that one covers the D1 and D2. Issue number 59 includes the FCM 36, as well as other vehicles. If you want something more current, there is the new Vanguard title, French Tanks of World War II, Part 1, which covers the French infantry and battle tanks, and that one's by Stephen Zaloga. He's written several Osprey titles in the last few years on French tanks, so we'd very much recommend his stuff. There's also a book that you'll see us recommending probably in every single one of these French videos, and that is the Encyclopedia of French Tanks and Armored Vehicles, 1914 to 1940 by Francois Villiers. This one it's an encyclopedia. It's heavily illustrated. It doesn't have super in-depth descriptions of each vehicle, but quite a bit of text, but it is an absolutely gorgeous book in terms of the illustrations. So if you have an interest in French vehicles in that interwar period, it's definitely worth taking a look at. That's about it for books. There are a couple online sources we also would like to mention. One is at the Tank Archives website. What they do there is primarily translate Russian language sources into English for the North American market, and they've been going through a lot of the articles by Russian researcher Yuri Pashalok, and he's written articles on all three of the vehicles we covered in this episode, so I'll put links to those, and that's just a really interesting website. I think, if you're interested in tanks, you should definitely check it out. Also, we cannot recommend enough the Inside the Hatch series from the Chieftain, Nick Moran, who is the chief researcher at World of Tanks. He goes around to different musea and has a crew. They show him walking around examining the exterior of these tanks, and then actually gets inside these tanks and gives his evaluation of what he thinks in terms of the ergonomics. So it's really interesting. His examination of the FCM 36 is quite interesting, and he really shows how cramped and in some ways impractical even these French tanks were as fighting vehicles, at least in regards of the crew ergonomics. So we will also put a link to that video. Unfortunately, he has not looked at the D1 or D2. I think actually this FCM is the first vehicle we've covered in our series that he's covered. So anytime that there's an overlap there, I will mention it in the further reading section. So that's about it for our recommendations, and we hope you enjoyed the episode, and we will hopefully see you for the next episode, which will be on the H35 and R35.